Today, we're diving into the remarkable life of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, better known to the world as Pope Francis. His journey from humble beginnings in Argentina to becoming one of the most influential religious leaders of our time is nothing short of extraordinary. You know, to really understand Pope Francis, we need to go back to where it all began. Buenos Aires, Argentina, December 17, 1936. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born to Italian immigrants. His dad, Mario, was a railway worker, and his mom, Regina, was a dedicated homemaker. They weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, just a hard-working, middle-class family trying to make ends meet. Little Jorge grew up in Flores, a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, surrounded by 4 siblings. From what we know about his childhood, it was pretty normal. Playing soccer in the streets with friends, helping out at home, attending local schools. But there was always something a bit different about him. A thoughtfulness, a sense of compassion that stood out. I think what's really interesting is how formative his grandmother Rosa was in his early life. He often talked about her later, saying she was the one who really taught him about faith. She wasn't just going through the motions. She lived her Catholic faith in practical ways, showing young Jorge how spirituality could be meaningful in everyday life. School wasn't always easy for him. He had a respiratory infection when he was young that required part of his lung to be removed, something that would follow him throughout his life. But despite health challenges, he was a curious kid with a sharp mind. By all accounts, he was respectful to his teachers, but not afraid to question things, a trait that would define his approach to leadership decades later.
This village in Italy has been drawn out of obscurity by its ties with Pope Francis. Porta Comaro Stazione, population 275, most of them farmers and laborers, is barely more than a hamlet in the northern Piedmont region, straddling a highway. On Sunday, churchgoers here were happy to show us photos taken with the new Bishop of Rome. The Argentinian-born Cardinal Bergoglio, promoted to pontiff, traces his roots to this place. It's where his father's family came from and where his cousins still live.
Anch'io sono nato in una famiglia di migranti. Mio papà, i miei nonni, come tanti altri italiani, sono partiti per l'Argentina e hanno conosciuto la sorte di chi resta senza nulla. Anch'io avrei potuto essere tra gli scartati di oggi. Ritengo molto importante che nel mondo di oggi i migranti diventino testimoni dei valori umani essenziali per una vita dignitosa e fraterna. Sono valori che voi portate dentro, che appartengono alle vostre radici. Una volta rimarginata la ferita dello strappo, dello sradicamento, voi potete far emergere questa ricchezza che portate dentro, un patrimonio di umanità preziosissimo.
As Jorge grew into his teenage years and early 20s, Argentina was going through some major political upheaval. This wasn't just background noise for him. It shaped how he saw the world and his place in it. After finishing high school, Jorge didn't immediately pursue the priesthood like you might expect. Instead, he worked as a chemical technician and even, for a brief time, as a bouncer at a nightclub. Can you imagine? The future pope checking IDs at the door. It just goes to show that life takes unexpected turns. But something was stirring in him. At 21, while visiting a church on September 21, 1953, he had what he described as a profound spiritual experience. He went to confession and afterward felt called to religious life. It wasn't a lightning bolt moment that you see in movies, but more of a quiet certainty that grew over time. So, in 1958, at age 21, he entered the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. The Jesuits are known for their intellectual rigor and social justice focus, and this fit perfectly with Jorge's questioning nature and concern for the marginalized. He didn't rush through his formation. He spent nearly 15 years studying and teaching before becoming a priest.
Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio surprised the world when he became Pope Francis. Some of the most bewildered were members of the new pope's religious order, the Society of Jesus. Father James Martin, an American Jesuit, recalled the many feelings he went through that day.
Well, there's never been a Jesuit pope, and so there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of excitement, and there have been some times when Jesuits have been seen by some in the Vatican with suspicion. And so there was this great sense of a cloud being lifted. One of the lasting impacts of Pope Francis's papacy on the Jesuits is that the Jesuits are no longer seen with suspicion by the larger church. People now have seen what a Jesuit is, what a Jesuit does, and how a Jesuit acts. And I think it's been, in a sense, sort of the mainstreaming of the Jesuits, after 450 years.
Jorge was ordained as a priest on December 13th, 1969, when he was 33 years old. From there, his leadership abilities quickly became apparent. By 1973, he was named Provincial Superior of the Jesuits in Argentina, basically the head of the entire order in the country. And remember, this was during Argentina's Dirty War, a period of state terrorism against political dissidents. This period of his life has been scrutinized and debated. Some critics claim he didn't do enough to stand up to the military dictatorship, while others maintain he worked quietly behind the scenes to protect many people. What's clear is that navigating leadership during this violent period taught him difficult lessons about power, compromise, and moral courage. After his time as provincial ended, he returned to more pastoral and academic work. In 1992, Pope John Paul II named him Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires, and just a few years later, he became Archbishop. It's worth noting that as he rose in the church hierarchy, his lifestyle remained remarkably unchanged. When he could have lived in the ornate archbishop's palace, he chose instead to live in a simple apartment. When he could have been driven around in a chauffeur-driven car, he took public transportation. He cooked his own meals and was known for spending time with the homeless and poorest residents of his city.
The day after Francis became pope, he was shown his new official residence. He strolled from room to room and met the staff. In a city where spacious homes are hard to come by, the papal apartment is downright palatial, with more than a dozen rooms and a stunning view. But according to reports in the Italian press, he said it was too big, and that it could accommodate 300 people. And now it's official, he's not moving in. Instead, he prefers to stay in room 201, a modest suite at the Casa Santa Marta, the residence where cardinals stayed during the conclave. He's chosen to ride the bus when he could have taken his official chauffeur-driven car and paid his own hotel bill after becoming pope. And he's wearing sensible black shoes, not the red ones, in which he's walking away from the trappings of power, if not power itself.
Fast forward to February 2013. Pope Benedict XVI did something that shocked the world. He resigned, becoming the first pope in nearly 600 years to step down voluntarily. This created an unusual situation where a new pope needed to be elected while the previous one was still alive. When Cardinal Bergoglio traveled to Rome for the conclave, the meeting where cardinals elect a new pope, he packed a small bag and bought a round-trip ticket. By all accounts, he had no expectation of becoming pope and planned to return to his duties in Argentina. The conclave began on March 12, 2013. Now, what happens in a conclave is supposed to remain secret, but reports suggest that Bergoglio quickly emerged as a frontrunner, despite not being considered among the favorites beforehand. On March 13th, white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, signaling that a new pope had been chosen. When Cardinal Jean-Louis Tauran stepped onto the balcony and announced, "Habemus Papam," we have a pope, and then said the name Georgium Marium Bergoglio, many people were genuinely surprised. And then came another surprise. The new pope announced he would take the name Francis, after Francis of Assisi, the 13th century saint known for his humility and concern for the poor. No previous pope had chosen this name, and it immediately signaled his priorities. When Pope Francis first stepped onto the balcony to greet the crowd in St. Peter's Square, he did something unexpected. Before giving his blessing, he asked the people to pray for him. This gesture of humility set the tone for a papacy that would break conventions in many ways.
You can feel now a palpable tension here as they realize any vote now could bring a vote.
Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam. Georgium Marium Bergoglio.
It was a total surprise when they said Bergoglio, and I remember everybody, who?
From Argentina, Bergoglio.
The first Jesuit pope.
The first pope from Latin America.
You knew in the first 30 seconds that the pontificate was going to be different from the moment he walked out onto that balcony.
He was not wrapped in furs. He did not have red velvet on. He did not have red shoes on.
And he steps to the microphone and he finally said,
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
Buonasera. Good evening.
He's the first pope who didn't come from Europe in 1,000 years. He's the first pope from the Western Hemisphere.
Vorrei dare la benedizione, ma prima vi chiedo un favore.
And then, of course, that massive thing of turning the tables and inviting the people to bless him.
Facciamo in silenzio questa preghiera de voi su di me.
The people prayed over their pope. This was unheard of.
What touched me was his humility, the humble request for prayers. I thought, he gets it. I knew immediately what kind of pope he would be.
He chose the name of Francis, one of the greatest of the saints of the Catholic Church, right? Saint Francis of Assisi.
Francis was the saint of the poor, and this was like flinging down a gauntlet.
Come vorrei una chiesa povera e per I poveri.
From day one, Pope Francis made it clear this wasn't going to be business as usual. The small symbolic choices were telling. He chose to live in the Vatican guest house rather than the papal apartments, wore simpler vestments, and carried his own bag. He made headlines for washing the feet of prisoners on Holy Thursday, including women and non-Catholics, breaking with tradition that had limited this ritual to men. His first apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, or The Joy of the Gospel, laid out his vision for the church. In it, he emphasized the need for an outward-looking church concerned with mercy, service to the poor, and joy and faith rather than rigid adherence to rules. Those early years were defined by memorable moments and quotes. When asked about gay priests, he famously said, "Who am I to judge? Not changing church doctrine, but signaling a more compassionate tone."
Speaking on the plane journey home from Brazil, Pope Francis has said homosexuals should not be marginalized but integrated into society. There's no problem with this orientation, he added, but he reaffirmed Catholic Church teaching that homosexual acts are a sin and condemned what he described as lobbying by gay people.
Le lobby tutti non sono buoni.
All lobbies are not good, he told reporters, but
Se una persona è gay,
if a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge him?
ma chi sono io per giudicarla?
The Pope said gay clergymen should be forgiven and their sins forgotten. In 2005, his predecessor Pope Benedict said men with deep-rooted homosexual tendencies should not be priests. On the Church's ban on women priests, Francis said the door is closed, adding that women should, however, play a greater role.
He embraced people with severe disfigurements, kissed the feet of refugees, and spoke out strongly against what he called an economy that kills, referring to extreme capitalism that benefits the few at the expense of the many. In 2015, he published Laudato Si', an encyclical letter that addressed environmental issues, connecting care for the planet with care for the poor, and criticizing consumerism and irresponsible development. It wasn't just aimed at Catholics, but at every person living on this planet. And it made clear that for Francis, environmental justice and social justice couldn't be separated.
It's an encyclical the Pope describes as both dramatic and joyful. The document, titled Laudato Si', or Praise Be to You, calls on Christians to care for creation and not to ignore the wounds of Mother Nature. The Pope describes with great clarity what many scientific experts already agree on, including pollution that leads to premature deaths, global warming, which goes hand in hand with increasing sea levels and other extreme weather conditions. The marginalized have less and less access to drinkable water, the disappearance of crops and animals that are essential for the survival of many. These points, writes the Pope, are at least in part caused by the actions of mankind, and so we should respond. The Pope also states that the problem is not an environmental one, but by and large an ethical issue. He speaks out against companies that increase pollution and contamination in third world countries because the actions they carry out couldn't be approved in their developed nations. Case in point, the Amazon. In the document, the Pope laments that efforts to improve conditions and care for Mother Nature usually die out because of lack of interest. He speaks out against, quote, obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, that can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions.
One of the defining features of Pope Francis's papacy has been his global travels. Despite his age and having only one fully functional lung, he maintained a grueling travel schedule that took him to every continent except Antarctica. His choice of destinations often highlighted his priorities. His first trip outside Rome was to Lampedusa, an Italian island that was a major arrival point for migrants crossing the Mediterranean. There, he condemned what he called a globalization of indifference to the suffering of refugees.
A landmark crossing for Pope Francis. On his first official visit outside Rome, the pontiffs journeyed to the tiny island of Lampedusa off Sicily. Accompanied by a group of fishing boats from the island, the Pope carries a wreath to lay in the water in memory of those who've lost their lives trying to reach it. Lampedusa is the first port of safety for thousands of migrants and asylum seekers from North Africa every year. The UN says 8,000 people have landed on the island's coast in the first half of this year alone. The destination is considered to be a highly symbolic one for a pope who's been vocal about putting the poor at the center of his papacy.
In 2013, his visit to Brazil for World Youth Day drew massive crowds, especially his visit to a favela or slum in Rio de Janeiro. The following year, he visited the Holy Land, praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem and at the separation barrier between Israel and the Palestinian territories. In 2021, he made a particularly meaningful trip to Iraq, visiting areas devastated by ISIS and meeting with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the top Shiite cleric in the country. The trip carried significant security risks but represented his commitment to persecuted Christians and interfaith dialogue. What's remarkable about these trips is how he consistently sought out the most vulnerable people. These weren't just photo opportunities, but expressions of his belief that the Church should be closest to those who suffer.
Pope Francis has touched down in Rio de Janeiro for his first foreign trip as pontiff. Welcomed by Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, the Pope was also greeted by a large crowd for his landmark visit. But the numbers making up the official welcome were nothing compared to the throngs of people filling Rio's city centre. Initially foregoing the celebrated Pope-mobile, his motorcade was soon overwhelmed by crowds.
It began with a visit to the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest spot in Islam. The Grand Mufti made a political point by demanding an end to the Israeli occupation. Francis turned to his own message. May we respect and love one another as brothers and sisters, he said. May no one abuse the name of God through violence. At the Western or Wailing Wall, the holiest place Jews can pray, Francis slipped a note with the Lord's Prayer in Spanish into a crack. Then he embraced a rabbi and a Muslim leader, two friends from Argentina he brought on the trip as a symbol of interfaith friendship.
The Pope was greeted by Iraq's Prime Minister and local Catholic officials. Traditional dancers and musicians welcomed the Holy Father before he was escorted to the presidential palace.
Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis tackled some deeply entrenched problems within the Catholic Church. I'd say one of the most significant was his approach to the sexual abuse crisis. He established new procedures for accountability, removed several bishops who mishandled abuse cases, and in 2019 held an unprecedented summit on the protection of minors. Critics argued his reforms didn't go far enough or fast enough, while supporters pointed to concrete steps like the abolition of the pontifical secret for abuse cases and new laws requiring clergy to report abuse to church authorities.
Pope Francis has opened an unprecedented summit on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church with bishops from around the world. Francis opened the four-day meeting by insisting that the Church must listen to abuse victims. But survivors have voiced concerns that the Pope's efforts to raise awareness do not go far enough. The summit comes after an avalanche of allegations against Catholic priests accusing them of molesting young boys and raping nuns.
The holy people of God are looking at us and do not expect from us simple and predictable condemnations, but concrete and effective measures.
In 2021, he issued Traditionis Custodes, restricting the celebration of the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass, which some saw as an attempt to promote church unity and others viewed as dismissive of traditional Catholics. This illustrated the challenging balancing act of his papacy, trying to move the church forward while bringing along a diverse global community with different perspectives. Perhaps his most controversial document was Amoris Laetitia, which followed 2 synods on the family. While maintaining church teaching on marriage, it opened possibilities for divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion in certain circumstances, following discernment with priests. This sparked intense debate, with some cardinals formally requesting clarification. He faced health challenges throughout his papacy, most notably undergoing colon surgery in 2021, yet maintained a schedule that would be demanding for someone decades younger. His resilience became part of his witness, continuing to serve despite physical limitations.
Tonight, the Vatican says Pope Francis is recovering after the biggest health scare of his papacy. Doctors removed part of the Pope's colon on Sunday. He was suffering from diverticulitis, an inflammation of the intestines. The Pope, now 84, is expected to stay in the hospital for about a week.
Beyond his impact on institutions and policies, perhaps his greatest legacy is in the stories of individuals touched by his words and actions. The prisoner whose feet he washed, the disfigured man he embraced, the homeless person given showers in Vatican City, the migrant family he brought back to Rome from a refugee camp. In these personal encounters, we see most clearly the vision of church he tried to advance, one that, in his words, is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets. Pope Francis once said, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security." This quote perhaps best captures the essence of his papacy, a leadership defined not by pomp and circumstance, but by presence with the suffering and marginalized. His legacy reminds us that true influence doesn't always come from grand gestures or revolutionary changes, but sometimes from simple acts of humility and kindness that remind us of our common humanity. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the life of Pope Francis. If you found this valuable, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.